Hi, everybody. I have purchased a second hurdy-gurdy since sending in that initial fun fact, so the shame is ongoing. It just sort of continues. I've got a couple of shout-outs from right up here. First of all, to Jen and the interpreters. Thank you very much. I also want to shout out to Mark and Carl out in the back who have been indulging me with because you don't know how complicated it is to make sure that emoji-based slides present properly. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I had to wrangle some slides, so these guys are absolute saints. Make sure to thank the AV crew. All right, hi everybody. Let me just check that this. Wonderful. I'm here to talk about emoji. As Matt said, I am Q Walker. I work at Paperkite as the experience lead here in Te Whanganui-a-Tara, Wellington. You might notice, if you're a Kiwi, that I don't have a Kiwi accent. I'm a dirty foreigner. And yesterday you had a Bostonian talking to you about AI, and today you have a Bostonian talking to you about IA, so I thought that was fun. And I tend to like to walk around, but let's do some UX, because shout out to my people in the back. I was sitting in the back for the first part of yesterday, and you couldn't really see much, so I'm assuming you can see me here, okay? If I come down here, can you see me? Is it, okay, I'm getting some, all right. If I go like this, can you see me? No? This is a joke that I came up with in 3 in the morning when I should have been sleeping, but instead was, thank you, anxiety panel. All right. Whew. All right. So, like many people, I use emoji a whole lot. It's quite standard these days. And even all of the prior talks, like many of the prior talks have used emoji in them. It's become kind of ubiquitous. I want to call out Yutong's slideshow earlier because she used emoji really elegantly. She had this slide where it was like all different skin tones, hair types, all the different variants, genders, and all the job types. And then she flicked to her next slide, and it was everyone wearing, I think it was the chef. Was that? I thought that was so lovely. And that is one example of why I love emoji so much, because they help to illustrate so much. They really enhance our written communication in a way that I admire. And depending on the context, they can add humor, they can add nuance, they can add clarity, and they can add something a little sinister, too. Has anyone been following the news? So I'm looking at notes because I was literally editing my notes like an hour ago because of the news with Microsoft Bing's chatbot. Has anyone been following that? So it's creeping people out. And I saw a headline where it told a New York Times reporter, let me get the quote here, "I want to be alive." But it didn't just say that, it followed it with the purple grinning imp emoji, you know, the one that has horns? It's devilish. It makes it sinister. So it took what was otherwise kind of a weird message, but fairly innocent, and made it suddenly very sinister, which is really interesting. So this suddenly raises questions of should AI be allowed to use emoji? I don't know. That's a whole other talk. That's not the first time I'm going to say that here. Anyways, because emoji are made to fit with written communication, they live in their own little keyboards on our devices, and there are thousands of them. Currently, there are over 3,600 different emoji in the standard sort of set. And that's when you count all the variants that, like skin tone and gender and hairstyle and everything. But obviously, there must be some pretty smart information architecture behind the scenes to help us navigate and use all that, right? You know where I'm going already with this. I see someone smiling. Yeah, no, it's all over the place. It's really, it's really all over the place. Everyone's taking the same set of characters and kind of throwing different, throwing them into different categories to see what sticks. And but there's some interesting ways that emoji platforms are kind of accommodating. I just used the word platforms. This is a little caveat. I'm going to be using the term platform to refer to proper platforms, products that support emoji, entire operating systems. So don't at me on this one. Just I know it's crude, but I'm just going to be using the term platforms a whole bunch. All right. So another heads up is that I'm going to be referring to a whole lot of different resources in this talk. I have compiled them all in a handy-dandy QR code that you can scan at the very end of the talk, so just hold on to it. I'm also keenly aware, back row folks, that all of my contact information is at the bottom of the screen and you're not going to be able to see it. I got you. It's in the resources. So you're good. So a little bit of background. This started as a pure pet project, just simple curiosity. I noticed a couple of emoji tend to bounce around a whole bunch between categories, the lobster being one, heart emojis being another. It's like sometimes they're in like people and smileys, and sometimes they're in symbols, and like, ooh, you kind of have to like second guess it every time you're using a new product. And so I started compiling this just for my own interest. And then I heard that Crux magazine were going to prepare an IA-themed issue. And so I decided to send along the gist of my research just to see if there's any interest. And to my great surprise, they wanted to publish it. They even made it the cover story, to my absolute shock. I've noticed that they have physical copies downstairs at the Optimal Workshop section. Pick up one. I'll offer signatures if you want, so I'll sign it. It's fine. So while I was doing the first round of research, I found lots of different ways to improve my own process. So what I wrote about in here was like the first draft is cool, but there's so many different ways to improve it. And meanwhile, Unicode continued releasing updates. So this is their most recent update. And Unicode are sort of the definitive source for emoji releases across different platforms. There's that word again, platforms. So in preparing for this talk, I decided to incorporate their latest version again. So what I'm sharing today is it's like the Crux story, but evolved a little bit farther, and it's coming out of this second iteration of research. I wish I could say it's done, but I have a feeling there's going to be a third. So, spoiler alert, Unicode is going to come up a whole lot in this talk. And Unicode, anyone who works at Unicode has my deepest sympathies because their work is very, very difficult. And while there are lots of different ways to display the same emoji, like I alluded to with my slides, I'm defaulting to Apple's emoji set to illustrate my points today. I made this on a Mac, and Apple emojis are kind of settling into the default. A lot of people recognize them. So you can imagine my dismay when you put it into PowerPoint, and they're all different. Okay, what's my research goal? So I really wanted to understand why this thing I was seeing across different platforms, some emoji are stable and some are volatile. Some emoji bounce around from category to category depending on where, I guess whatever decision they had made when they put their IA together. And that's what I consider volatile in this context. It's just like, ooh, this one moves a whole bunch. For instance, my favorite emoji, the lobster, is usually found in one of two categories. I'll tell you what they are later, but you can probably already guess. So I was curious to learn more about how widespread this issue is, and is it an issue, and could it be a good thing? And really just figuring out why it happens in the first place. So I did what any researcher does. I set up a spreadsheet. I set up a really, really big spreadsheet. And I compared the IA locations of different emoji across a whole bunch of different platforms. And this is ongoing. I see a new platform. Like I was just texting someone on WhatsApp the other day, and I was like, oh no, another AI or IA. I got to add WhatsApp to the list. I couldn't find any clean data sets at all that were up to date, so everything is done manually. So like those thousands of emoji, I was like put in manually. And the manual effort has actually had a good side. It's worked really well. I've noticed a lot along the way. I've been forced to notice a lot along the way. And so this is going to be included in the resources. I've made this public. Anyone can edit it. I'm not precious about this work at all. But you will go in there and you will see 400 plus comments of me being like, this was a lazy decision, and things like that. I kind of make a bunch of roasts in there. So what have I found through doing all of this? Well, mainly, the thing I've found is that there are two prevailing sort of frameworks that people are using when they are making decisions about what IA to use. And these are broadly explicit versus implicit. And what I mean by that is Explicit is very utilitarian. It tells you exactly what an emoji is. It tells you, like, it describes the thing that you are seeing presented in the icon. Implicit is more symbolic. It tells you what it means. Not what it is, what it means. And so we enter this world of sort of metaphor and context, and it really tells you more about what it stands for. And there are two ways to determine roughly what kind of IA you're looking at that I've figured out so far. There's probably oodles of other ways too. The first method is to just pick any emoji and look at where it sits in the IA. You can start to get some clues from there. By looking at the context that the platform has given it, you can learn a lot about whether they're going more explicit or implicit. I really like the ballet shoes as an example. So Unicode is really utilitarian about this. They're like, ballet shoes are footwear. They belong in footwear. And they're found in like a clothing subcategory alongside a bunch of other shoes, specifically women's shoes. Women's shoes, because Unicode is very gendered in how they label their emoji, but that's a whole other talk, too. And then compare it to Apple, which is quite implicit. So for Apple, ballet shoes are less about the shoes and more about the ballet. And so you find them in a context of performing arts. There's this sort of subcategory in there. It's telling you that these shoes are used to represent an entire art form. They're not just footwear. So that's using context to kind of figure out what system you might be working in. The other way I have found is to look at how the emoji is named if you have access to the emoji labeling. It's a little harder in some platforms than others. But let's take this example. So I'm going to once again compare Unicode and Apple, because even though I looked at other data sets, theirs is really nice and convenient to compare them. But in Unicode, this is referred to as a red paper lantern. And they're totally not wrong. Like, this is a red paper lantern. It's subcategorized as part of this light sources kind of category. It's explicit. It's exactly what it says. But Apple kind of got what it's used for. And so in the implicit Apple system, it's referred to as an izakaya lantern. Who knows what an izakaya lantern is? Oh, a couple of hands. Awesome, awesome. So you'll know that it has specific connotations in Japan. This isn't just a source of light. It's more than that. This is where you can go get a drink. So this is a sign of a good time. This is shorthand for party. And so they put it in this party accessories subcategory there. So it's like, okay, they get what it's used for. Even within these two prevailing frameworks, there are disagreements. Like I mentioned, my favorite lobster emoji. Unicode categorizes it as food. Literally every other platform I've looked at so far considers this an animal, or puts it in animals in nature is a category you often see. And these are both explicit placements, because from a human perspective, they're both. I mean, lobsters are animals, and whether or not you eat them, a lot of people do, so they count as food. So what would the implicit placement be? If it was truly implicit, you'd probably say, you might argue, and people have, that the lobster emoji represents the state of Maine. Shout out to my Americans. You might see this representing the state of Maine, or you might see it as broadly representing living in a coastal community. But if that were the case, if you were in an implicit framework, you'd probably see it in the travel and places category, which is a pretty frequent one. But it's not there, so we don't use it in that way. So there's some disagreements even in explicit and implicit. So let's talk about presentation then. The thing, again, that I said made my slides so difficult. This lobster is red. I want you to think about that for a second. This lobster is red. Lobsters aren't typically red unless they are cooked. So from a strictly utilitarian perspective, Unicode is arguably in the right. This is a picture of food. Most living lobsters are something between brown and purple. They only turn red when you boil them. A scary prospect for my friend. And the presentation really, really matters. So take the syringe emoji. There's a really significant effort underway to standardize this so that it has clear fluid in it or it looks like an empty vial, rather than blood red. This is how it appeared. This is sort of the standard of how it appeared prior to 2021, which is when they changed it. It used to imply blood donations, did a great job with that. But when you have, I don't know, like a major public health effort to get people vaccinated, it really makes a difference when the syringe that is being shown on like across platforms, on media, in the news, like it really makes a difference whether that is sort of a scary red thing or if it is a like sort of innocuous looking clear vial. So if you're going to try to convince people to participate, the presentation really, really matters. How an emoji presents is based on the platform, and this still isn't quite standardized. There's still a couple of platforms that present it as sort of blood red. Standardization is really tough. So Unicode and Apple tend to sort of lead the way of saying, this is how we want to present this now. But other systems and platforms might choose to delay or change the release. So there's not a lot of standardization. But when you have some standardization happening in some areas and not others, it can really, really influence how stuff comes across. So due in part to public safety concerns, in 2016, the gun emoji was redesigned from plainly a piece of weaponry, a gunmetal gray, like pistol-looking thing, to a toy water pistol. But despite its innocent revamp, you can still see its dark history based on where it sits within the IA. On the left, I've screen capped where it sits in Apple. So this is a screen cap from my Mac, and you can see like weapon, 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 toy water gun. And it's like, it kind of hasn't really shaken that. Whereas Unicode puts it over here next to like some frivolous playthings. These are the toys. And so you can see, even though the emoji itself has been changed, where it lives in the IA can still tell you a lot about its history or how it's intended to be used. I've dropped a link into the resources for an article where a researcher, who I think works at Unicode, a researcher sent out a very innocent text inviting people to play in the park and used the toy water pistol, and then looked at how it landed across different devices, and it's actually chilling. So it's kind of that same thing with the chatbot sending out like creepy smiling impish face, like, and so I was thinking about that and like, oh well, is it possible that maybe they're using Microsoft's own standards for presenting emoji. Maybe it's just the Apple one is being used in the news. And so I looked it up, and no, the smiling imp emoji is equally terrifying when it's on the Microsoft platform than the one that's getting used in the media, which is usually Apple or Unicode. So this we've got thousands of emoji, limited categories, and like huge consequences for getting it wrong. So like, what are we supposed to do? Lots of platforms have been addressing this by presenting what I consider like a hyper-customized option, which will be quite familiar. It's frequently used. And it's so easy, you don't even have to set it up. It just happens automatically as you're sending emoji around. And it's influenced by both frequency and recency. Recency sometimes like more than frequency, I'd say. And it changes as often as you do. So that's sort of a shortcut. There's also a search bar, which any information architect in the room will recognize as a cop-out. But in this case, probably a useful cop-out, so maybe we can allow it. Some platforms take this even further. So Slack has an organization level category, including UXNZ's Slack. You can make custom emoji in there. Not only do you have the 3,600 plus official standard emoji, but you also have basically an enormous MISC category to work with. And this results in a very personalized outcome. At PaperKite, we have a growing set of emoji that only mean anything to us. Hello, paperkiters. We have this growing set of emoji that only mean anything to us, which is a really interesting way of enhancing our communication, evolving our culture within the same basic premise of emoji are here to serve the written communication. this slide used to have a lot more emoji on it, but I had to remove all the embarrassing ones, so we're left with 5. So looking to the future, I don't think we can have a fully standardized framework, nor do I necessarily think we should. I don't think any IA can be completely explicit or implicit, right? It's so complicated. And looking at the differences is really, really interesting. So I think platforms should have the ability to categorize by what's going to be the most meaningful to their users. So I guess ultimately the question is, why does any of this matter? Just like any IA, the IA for emoji is one way that humans make sense of a really nuanced world. Through our attempts to categorize everything, we can see something about ourselves reflected in the IA that we create. As the standard bearers of emoji, whether they kind of officially adopt that or not, Unicode have this major responsibility to ensure that they release as few new emoji per release as possible. It's really, really hard to get a new emoji approved. They're releasing fewer and fewer with each update. And what they choose to release and what they choose not to release are both super important. And this is where this is where I'm going to get a little personal for a sec, because there's a part of this story that I didn't share with Crux magazine, but I'm going to share it here with you today. Like I've been saying, I use the lobster emoji all the time, and I use it not because I don't eat lobsters, so I'm not using it for that, and I very, very rarely actually mean the animal, literally, when I'm using it. I use it because there's a third category that kind of undermines any formal attempts at IA, and that is cultural usage. So back in 2018, Unicode released one of their updates. They released 11.0, and a certain crustacean made the cut. We were all very happy for the lobster. But there was something missing, and really painfully missing to some people, and that is the trans pride flag. So for years, multiple organizations had been campaigning for a trans flag emoji, and their efforts had fallen flat. It's just like time and time again, it just wasn't getting through. Unicode was just like, no, it's not happening. So when the lobster emoji got approved, it was a bit of a blow to the community. On Unicode's website, you can see the winning petition for every single new emoji that is approved. And so trans rights activists could see the reason why the lobster emoji was approved. I went and looked at it. There were a few winning petitions that are listed on the site, and it basically boils down to this. Pardon the pun. The absence of the lobster emoji was essentially inconvenient for a small group of, a community of New England lobster catchers. And like, no shade to New England, hey. I'm being a little bit reductive here. It's not just that it was important to them, like there were some okay points, but it's nothing close to the sheer quantity of people who would be affected by having a trans pride flag actually represented. Sorry, I'm actually shaking. This is this is the first time I've talked about this. So the trans community adapted and queered the lobster emoji. And if you, which is amazing. If you were on queer Twitter, which is a niche place, if you were on queer Twitter in 2018, 2019, you probably remember seeing suddenly there were lobster emoji everywhere. Lobsters happen to be perfect for this for a number of biological reasons, but I'm going to stop there because, again, that's another talk. This quote from trans rights activist Charlie Cragg speaks to the gravity of Unicode's decision, and I'm going to read this because people need to hear it. We now have a lobster emoji because people suffered, and this is from the winning petition, frustration and confusion at having to use a shrimp or crab. Surely representation for the trans community is more important than a crustacean. Blows my mind. So, people adapted and so did I. And when I started working at PaperKite in 2019, for the first time, in my life I felt safe and comfortable coming out as trans non-binary. Sorry. What symbol did I use to mark the occasion? A lobster. What emoji became my sort of shorthand signature? A lobster. Which is why I always notice where it lives in the IA. This is why I notice that it bounces around, and this is how we notice that stuff is inconsistent anyways. Anyways, Unicode eventually got the message, and in 2020, Emoji version 13.0 was released, and guess what was in there? Who sees it? Yes! Finally, which makes me feel a little bit like this. So again, and this is for real, the conclusion, how we categorize things says something about who we are. And it reflects us, it reflects our attitudes, it reflects our beliefs, our perspectives. And emoji are important. Like, they help us to facilitate communication in what is increasingly a globalized world, and on this digital environment, at least. And I feel this way, having gone through sorting all these manually and looking at all of them. And information architecture really wants everything to have its proper place. A lobster can't be two things. A decision has to be made. But the lobster can be an animal. It can be food. It can represent the state of Maine. It can be a symbol for the queer community. There are no limits to how we can use all of the icons that we have at our disposal. And this is why I believe a standard IA isn't possible nor desirable, because by looking at attempts to categorize things, we ultimately arrive at a greater appreciation of the many different ways that we can make sense of the world. Thank you very much. This is the QR code I promised. Please jump in and join me. I'm not precious at all about this work, and I want more people's perspective in it. Yes, thank you.